Hello everyone and welcome back to a part 2 of the differences between Australia and the US. I'm specifically going to be comparing Melbourne, Australia to the Bay Area in California, as I just moved from California over to Australia about 2 months ago, so I've noticed a bunch of differences and I wanted to share with you guys what those differences are. If you're interested in seeing more differences, definitely hop over to part 1 as I jump into some different differences that I didn't mention in this video. Of course it's Australia because all the birds are going crazy outside. Alright, now let's jump into those differences. One big difference that I noticed pretty recently was I went into the city. I have a video about it, and in that video I think I really noticed when we're in the city that when I would look up I could see all the stars even though we were in the city. Australia just has so much less light pollution than the US because, well, in terms of like the entire country, there's like, I don't know, I think about like 5 big cities, but in the US there's hundreds and hundreds of big cities. So because of that, the light pollution is really spread out. Like if you look at a map of light pollution from the US, it's super heavy on the East Coast, and then there's kind of a gap, and then on the West Coast as well there's like a big group of light pollution, where in Australia I feel like the light pollution is just focused in these little pockets, but even though it's focused in those pockets, there really wasn't that much light pollution. I don't know whether it's like the design of the lights or just how many people live in Australia compared to the US, but it was so crazy looking up in the middle of the city surrounded by all these giant tall buildings and seeing stars, which is what I'm not used to being in the Bay Area. Now some more differences about the whole car situation. I think most people know that in Australia you drive on the left side of the road compared to in America you drive on the right, and because of that the driver's side seat is also on the opposite side. Another thing when driving too that I didn't even realize was illegal in Australia is driving barefoot, because in America I feel like whenever I'd wear like flip-flops, or Australians call them thongs, but whenever I'm wearing like some kind of sandal and maybe like, or I'm going to the beach or I'm going to the pool, I just won't wear shoes when I drive. I remember my dad saying something about it because he grew up in Australia, and he was saying like, oh, you're not allowed to drive barefoot, like that's legal. Turns out it's only illegal in Australia. So in Australia as well, cars always have right of way unless you're in a pedestrian crosswalk. When it comes to crosswalks as well, you have to stand there and wait to make sure that the car is going to stop, and then when you walk across you have to say thank you. It is huge in Australia that you have to like throw up a hand or a wave and just be like, oh, thank you for stopping for me, even though you're supposed to. Otherwise you're a dick. In California, I think you can just kind of walk whatever, nobody really cares about a pedestrian, because also just pedestrians have right of way in a lot of situations. But like in parking lots and anytime you need to cross, most of the time a car is going to stop for you in California. I mean, maybe not everywhere, but most of the time they're going to try and stop for you, and the pedestrians have the right of way. In Australia, like when you're walking in a parking lot, you really have to be paying attention to where the cars are, because the cars aren't going to stop. Like they're not thinking about, oh, I have to watch out for the pedestrians. If they're walking across, I have to stop for them. They're just driving. In California, pedestrians have right of way, right? So if you're walking in a parking lot, you can walk right out behind a car and they have to stop for you. For anybody from America visiting Australia, definitely understand that cars have right of way over pedestrians. Don't get hit. Something that I also think is really cool about Australian crosswalks is that when you're going to go like click that button before you cross the street, like where there's lights and stuff, in Australia they have like little beeping sounds. Some places in California have them, but it's not really standard across all the crosswalk. But when you press that button, there's like a slow beep on your side and a beep on the other side of the road where you're crossing to. So it's like, so because of that, you're able to judge the distance of how far it is, and it's really for blind people who are unable to, you know, see the distance, but they can hear the sounds of it and know how far away it is. Also, because they can't see like the little green walking man, because then when it turns green, it starts going really fast. It goes letting you know to go and walk across the road. So in California they do have that, but the sound in Australia is so unique that I think it was like in Billie Eilish's song, where I think one of her family members was like traveling in Australia, recorded like the beeping sound and then sent it to her as a sample, and they used it in one of her songs. So I thought that was pretty cool. Another last thing about when it comes to cars too is that in California, every time you would see a stop sign, in Australia, you would have a roundabout instead. With stop signs, it's whoever gets to the stop sign first will then go across the intersection. I know there's roundabouts in both countries, but there's just so many more roundabouts in Australia, and I feel like the flow of them is a lot better. You don't necessarily have to wait and be the first one there. It's just if it's clear ahead, you would go. So because of that, I think there is more movement throughout the intersection. And because in California, like, real estate is very expensive, I can understand why they just want like the best thing to work in the least amount of real estate and the least amount of land. The one downside about roundabouts though is that I feel like you really have to be paying attention when you're going through a roundabout. I feel like the stop sign is a little bit more like dummy proof for that. It just kind of takes away the flow from driving though, because with roundabouts, most of the time, if it's not a busy day, you don't have to be worrying about like stopping. You're slowing down and you're yielding, but you don't have to come to a complete stop before going forward. I think it's a little bit more efficient for roundabouts. I think sometimes roundabouts can really work, but then sometimes in the city there will be roundabouts that have lights as well, which I think confuses me so much when I'm driving, because for some of them you would stop in the roundabout and there's lights in the roundabout, and it just drives me crazy when I'm driving in the cities. Okay, so we've talked enough about cars. Let's go into some other differences between the two countries. One thing I found was really funny in Australia is that when you get packages, if you're not there to actually pick up the package, and this could be like shoes or like camera batteries or anything else that I've shipped, most of the time you have to be at the door and you have to be home in order to take the package in. Otherwise they leave a note on your door and you have to go to the post office to pick it up. Occasionally that happens in America because maybe you have like a very important package. You have to signify that you're there to take the package. The downside of that too is anytime you need to go to the post office, there's normally like a giant line going out of the post office. Another little small difference that I noticed as well about Australia is that when you're hanging up something like, say, a poster or a piece of paper somewhere, you use this thing called blue tack instead of tape. Like, let's say we're hanging up a poster. In California, I would take a piece of tape, roll it into kind of like a circle, and then stick that on the wall and stick the poster on it. But in Australia, you have like this, you would buy this ball of like blue tack, which is kind of like this like blue sticky putty. Grab a little piece of it and you would stick that on the wall and then put the poster on top of it. I don't really have a preference to either blue tack or tape, but I just thought it was interesting that in America, most of the time, we're not using blue tack, we're just use tape. And in Australia, you use blue tack. I don't know. Little cultural differences that I picked up on. Now we're gonna talk a little bit about restaurants. Most people know that in Australia, there isn't really a tipping culture, but in California and in America, it's very heavy on the tipping culture. So coming to Australia, it was like a breeze because I didn't have to think about tipping. Also, all of the taxes included in the price, and I'm just not thinking about like, oh, I have to bring a little bit extra money. If I'm buying a meal for $20, in California, I'd be like, okay, $20, but plus tax, plus I have to tip, it might end up being like $23 or $24 and some odd cents. The great thing in Australia is like, if I'm going to buy something for $20, I just need to bring $20. I don't have to think about tax, I don't have to think about tip. Another key part of that too is that in California, it's like this new wave of restaurants. When you're tipping before you've even had the service. So it's a little bit frustrating sometimes in California because say you're going up and you're buying an ice cream, they flip the little iPad around and they're like, what do you want to tip? 15, 20, 25%? And it's like, I'm just getting an ice cream. The tipping culture is a little bit annoying. I understand why it's there though, and it's because the workers aren't getting the pay that they should be getting and they're relying on tips for that extra money. It can be a little sad sometimes as well, knowing that you're supporting that person's job by tipping. You want to tip, you want to help them out, but at the same time, it shouldn't be up to you. It should be up to the employer, making sure that they're pricing everything right in order to pay their workers a decent wage. A little story time too. I was in Utah with my mom and we went out to like a Brazilian steakhouse, and one of the girls that was working there said that she said her wage was something maybe like $3 an hour or $4 an hour, like something insane. I know like Utah has a lower minimum wage, but like it was well below the minimum wage. And the reason being is that they included tips in their wage. So they expect them to get, you know, some odd number of money in their tips and to use that as part of their wage. What if one week the tips aren't as good, or you're just not getting paid that much because you're getting technically only like $3 or $4 an hour? So I don't know, it makes me mad and I don't want to spend more time talking about this, but I love that Australia doesn't have a tipping culture. I love it so much. Thank you, Australia. Another difference too that I noticed is that when you're washing your clothes, even though people will have a perfectly fine dryer that completely works and it's not a problem, not an issue, people prefer to dry their clothes outside or like on a line, or what's the word for them? I think it's a drying rack, but when I think of a drying rack, I think of dishes. Anyways, it's a clothes drying rack. So when you're washing your clothes, you're gonna be drying them on like the drying rack rather than like throwing them in the dryer. I don't really know the reason behind it, but it is really good for the environment because you're not using a dryer and you're not using electricity. You're literally using the sun, so that's great. Free energy. All it takes is like a little bit of time to like hang up your clothes. So if you don't care about that, totally fine, just dry your clothes on the line. I don't know whether it comes from like European influence as well, because I know in Europe a lot of the time they just don't have dryers, or they prefer to dry their clothes on the line. But yeah, I think it's kind of cool because I feel a little bit like a grandma in Europe, like throwing my clothes on the line, like over the alleyway in Italy or something. And a lot of people have their like these giant drying lines like built into their house, and a lot of houses just come with it. One difference too, obviously it's like a huge difference between Australia and America, is that the accents obviously are different, but also just like the little things about the accent as well. For example, like a lot of things are just shortened in Australia, and I'm gonna do a whole video about slang. Afternoon, arvo. If someone's like a bricklayer, you call them a brickie. Like, it's all these longer words are just shortened in Australia. California specifically, I always get outed for saying like a lot, and you've probably noticed throughout this whole video that I just throw in like. I don't know, there's just little things about the different accents and like the different things that we come from our culture that we just do little quirky things. I'm sorry if it bugs you, but it's just how I speak. Sorry, not sorry. Also, if you're looking for other videos around moving to Australia and my experience with moving, I recently got reached out to from a website where they interviewed me and they wrote an article on my experience, so definitely head over to their website and check that out. Alright, the sun is coming out for the end of this video, but I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for watching and supporting my channel. I will have a part 3 coming up somewhat soon, probably in about a month when I find out some more differences between the two countries. Also, if you're looking for daily updates, I do post a lot on my Instagram stories, so feel free to follow me over there and you can see kind of my daily updates. And with that, I hope you have a lovely day and much love.